Hey, this is going to be a start to finish guide on how you can take your plan for an application and turn it into a production-ready web application using Cursor. Now, the process that I'm about to show you is the same base process that I use on a day-to-day basis to build applications for other businesses. But don't worry, if you aren't technical, then you don't necessarily need to be technical to follow these same core steps. At each step, I'll break down the base technical concepts so you can grasp what's going on. So in this guide, we're going to first cover what is Cursor and how do you install it. We're then going to cover what is Node and NPM and how do you install them. Node and NPM are basically prerequisites that we need to install on our device so the applications can run smoothly and we can add certain functionality to them. We'll then cover how to get started with a recommended template. What I mean by this is web applications can be quite complex, and although Cursor and AI are good, setting those base foundations with something that a human has made usually is the best way to go. We'll then cover what the front end and the back end are. Again, you don't need to know the ins and outs of technical concepts. However, this is one of those things that it helps to have a base understanding of, because when we're building, we're going to need to work with our front end and with our back end. We'll then cover what MCPs and tools are. These will basically give our AI ways to understand and utilize external services. We'll then cover what Convex is and how to install it. So Convex is what we will use for our backend. So it will be our database and our way to securely handle logic in the backend. We'll then explore how to use the different modes of Cursor. So Cursor has 4 different modes that you can utilize when you're building, and each has its own use case, and we'll cover those use cases. We'll then cover what rules are inside of Cursor. We'll then ultimately cover how to build in Cursor. We'll then cover understanding the different parts of our code/repo, which is short for repository. Again, you don't need to understand the technical ins and outs here, but the more you can understand it and the more you can grasp it, the better, because it will allow you to better direct Cursor when you're prompting it. We'll then cover how to preview your application. So once you have something that you want to start clicking around in and testing, how do you actually run that application and access it? Then how to structure your building process. So there's 1,000,001 different ways you can prompt Cursor. And what I mean by that is not only how you structure your prompts, but in what order you build things. And more often than not, there is a better way to order your building process. Then how to add visual ways to verify your security. So what I mean by that is the data it's loaded in, it's not exposing data that it shouldn't expose. So if you're a non-technical builder, you can ask the AI to explain in plain English the logic that it's created, or create visual diagrams explaining the logic. And you can look at its explanation and the diagrams it creates, then verify if what it's created is secure. We'll then go through a little tip that I have for editing designs in a no-code way. Cursor actually has a built-in way to run the application, and in real time you can click around and change certain pieces of design. However, it still involves prompting the AI at the end of the day. So I have a different little add-on I like to use that allows us to click around and create prompts that we can then easily give Cursor for it to adjust specific parts of our designs. We'll then cover Git, also known as GitHub. So what is it, how to set it up, and how to install it. GitHub will essentially be where we store our code and how we can collaborate with others to edit our code. And lastly, we'll cover how to deploy our application to the World Wide Web so other people can access it. So without further ado, let's cover what is Cursor and how do we install it. Now, before we jump into what Cursor is, you first need to know what an IDE is. And an IDE stands for an integrated development environment. And all an IDE really is a code editor with some nice fancy utility features. So for example, this is Visual Studio. This is created by Microsoft. You've probably heard of it before. And as you can see at its core, it's simply just a code editor. So here you have the code of whatever current file you're viewing. Here you have all of your files. And here you have some tabs you can go through. So your files, you can search through your files. And then here you have some utility features. And so this ultimately is an IDE. And this is Cursor. And if I zoom out a little bit and put these side by side, like so, you're probably looking at these two and wondering what are the real differences. And that would be a valid thought. And the reason for that is because Cursor is literally built on top of Visual Studio. You are able to fork Visual Studio, meaning if you wanted to, you could clone Visual Studio. And so that is exactly what Cursor did. They cloned Visual Studio and they then simply built on top of it, which is why in Cursor, you have pretty much the same features as you have in Visual Studio. So you have all of your files. These tabs that you see in Visual Studio are these tabs that you see in Cursor. This core central part where you view the code of whatever file you're currently viewing, you have the same thing in Cursor. However, the one big differentiator and what we're all here for is this panel. So in Cursor, you have this chat panel. And in this chat panel, as you can imagine, you can use AI to edit the code. Now, I won't cover all the different features of this panel. We'll cover that later on in the video. For now, just understand that Cursor ultimately is an IDE. So let's now install Cursor. So to do so, you can just search for Cursor in whatever browser of choice and visit what is probably the first one that comes up, so cursor.com. Before we download it, you want to create an account, so click sign in. At the bottom, you can click sign up. You can enter your details manually, or you can continue with a provider like Google, which I will do. It will prompt you to start a pro plan. You can if you wish. If not, you can simply press skip for now. I'm going to turn data sharing off and continue. Press continue again, and you'll be prompted with this screen. From here, you can press download. That will download the installer. You can run that installer, and once you do, and ultimately open Cursor, you will see this screen. Now, before we progress, I highly recommend you do set up a paid account for Cursor because it will mean the end output from the AI is just miles better than it would be from the free plan. Cursor has 4 different pricing plans, and I recommend you start with the basic Pro plan. The reason the Pro plan is so much better than the free plan is that you have access to what they call the frontier models. This basically means you have access to whatever model you want. So when you're on the free plan, you have to use their auto mode, which then means your prompts get routed to whatever model they like. But when you're on the Pro plan, you can choose which models your prompts get routed to. So you can use a model like Codex, you can use a model like Sonnet or Opus from Anthropic. You can use the best models, and because you can use the best models, the end output is just way better. So for this video, I'll be using a paid account and I'll be using specific models. You're more than welcome to continue on the free account. Just know that on the free account, you'll be restricted to the auto mode and you won't be able to choose what specific models you want to use. Now from this screen, you can press sign in. It should automatically detect the account that you signed up with Cursor. So you can press yes, log in, and you can then close the window. So you're now signed in and we have Cursor installed. So next, let's cover what Node and NPM are and how to install them. So firstly, we have Node, and Node just stands for Node.js. And all Node essentially lets us do is run JavaScript in our computer outside of the browser. And since we'll be building in Cursor and Cursor doesn't live in our browser, we need a way to run JavaScript outside of our browser so we can run it inside of Cursor. Hence, we need Node. And then the next piece of this is NPM. And now to install NPM, we already need to have Node installed. And the reason for this is that NPM simply stands for Node Package Manager. So it's a package manager for Node. So you basically can consider NPM to be a big library of plugins that we can access and install some of those plugins in our project if we want to add certain pieces of functionality. So for example, in the NPM library, there might be a package for charts. And if we want to add charts to our project, we would install the charts library from NPM. Maybe we want some kind of maps library, like a Google Maps library. Again, we would use NPM to add this library. Or maybe you want some kind of signature pad so people can draw their signature in your app. Again, we could do this by installing a package from NPM. And again, just to reiterate the point, in order for us to install NPM, we need to first have Node. And so let's now install both of these. So we need to install Node and we need to install NPM. Again, you can just go onto your browser of choice and then type in install Node. You want to click on this one from nodejs.org. Just choose the latest version and then choose your operating system and leave these two as is. And then press the button to download the installer. Then you want to run that installer. And once that is done, you want to switch back over to Cursor. And how you do this will be slightly different depending whether you're on Windows or Mac. If you're on Mac, you just need to hover at the top here so that it shows the header bar. And you can click on Terminal and then click New Terminal. And if you're on Windows, it will be a similar thing. However, you won't need to hover to show this most likely. You should have an option in the top left and one of them should be Terminal. You can click Terminal and then press New Terminal. What we want to do is check the version of Node we have on our machine, because if Node has installed correctly, then when we run the command to check our Node version, we should see a valid version. So in the terminal, we can type node space -v, press enter. And as you can see, it shows me a valid version. And if you see a valid version, then you're good to go. And now for NPM, we don't actually need to do anything. When we install Node, NPM basically comes with Node. So now we have Cursor, it's good to go, and we have Node and NPM, they're also good to go. And so the next piece is getting started with the template. Now for the template, again, you're just going to want to go on your browser of choice, type in shadcn admin, and it should be the first one you see here, but basically you're looking for a GitHub link that looks like this. So shadcn admin dashboard. So when you click into this, this is essentially the template we are going to use. So this is a repository of code, and this has the code of an application, and we're going to use this application as a template and a foundation for our application. And now before we do this, I just want to give a shout out to this guy, Sat Niang. Apologies if I am butchering that name, but this guy has made this project open source and free for us to use. So a massive shout out to him. And so what we're going to do is you're going to click this code button in the top right. Here it gives you a link. And so you're going to want to press this button on the right so we can copy this link and then go back over to Cursor. In Cursor, you'll want to click Clone Repo, and then in this top bar, simply paste in that link you got, and you can press Enter, or you can click here to confirm your choice. You will then be asked where on your device you want to save this new folder. So basically what we're doing is we're creating a folder in our device somewhere, and this folder will store all of the code of our application. So you just want to select here where you want that folder to be stored on your device. Confirm your selection. You will then be prompted if you wish to open that repository, and you can press Open. Hey, it's me from the future. As I'm going through and editing this, I've realized that since I first installed Cursor, they've changed the default side this chat window appears on. So in the rest of the video, I have this chat window on the right-hand side. However, new installations of Cursor will likely have it by default on the left-hand side. If you would like to have the chat on the right-hand side, like I do in the rest of the video, you just need to go to the top panel, click on View, hover Appearance, and then you can click Move Primary Sidebar Left, and it will switch sides like so. Right, with that covered, let's get back to our regular scheduled programming. And essentially here, inside of Cursor, we have now been brought to that repository, aka that folder. And so on the left here, we see all of the files of that folder. And from now on, I'll term the folder as repository. So you see all of the files of that repository. And so you could click into a file, and once you do, you see all of the code of that file in the center here. Now, don't worry about what all of these files mean and what the code of each file means. Again, we'll be using Cursor and AI to build the application, so you don't need to know this. However, just know that all of those files live in this panel. And so the reason we wanted to start with this template is that in this repository now, we have a lot of the foundational stuff set up for us that is usually quite a pain in the backside to set up ourselves. And truthfully, whenever you ask Cursor to do this, it's probably going to take a different approach every single time. So using a template like this gives us a bit of security and peace of mind, knowing that a human has done the hard work in setting up these foundations, and now we can use AI to build on top of it. So for example, in this repository, we have all these different components that we can use, and all these components will have a consistent design system, meaning they'll use consistent colors, they'll use consistent corner radiuses, so curvatures of their edges, they'll use consistent shadows, consistent typographies, all that good stuff. So we can avoid some of the common telltale signs of AI slop and keep a consistent design system. And I won't show you in the code, but also with this repository, we have some very helpful frameworks set up in the background. So now that we have the template set up in Cursor, I want to explain the difference between the front end and the back end. Now, the front end is essentially what you see in the interface. So basically what you see in your browser. And so when you're interacting with the application and you then click on something, this usually involves interacting with some kind of logic in the background or fetching data from somewhere that doesn't exist in the application. And that is where the backend comes into play. So you can imagine in your interface, if you had a button to delete a product, when the user sees that button in the interface and clicks that button to delete the product, usually we have that product stored in a database somewhere. And so when they click that button to delete the product, we have to make a call to our backend to say, hey, this person wants to do a certain thing, so we need to handle this in the backend in some way. So in the case where the user clicks that button to delete the product, we send that information to the backend. So we say, hey, this is the action the user has taken. This is the part in the backend where it handles that logic. So it basically figures out what it needs to do. And in this case, because it's deleting something, it knows, okay, I need to delete this from the database. So it can then go and interact with the database, in this case, delete the thing, then figure out what it wants to return to the interface. So in this case, maybe it just sends a success message to say the deletion was successful, sends that back to the interface, and the interface can then do something with that. So in this case, it might show a success notification to say, hey, the thing has been deleted successfully. And so that's pretty much just how the front end interacts with the back end. Now, you might be wondering why we have these two core distinctions between the front end and the back end. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this, but the biggest one you can consider for right now is security. So in the case where the user pressed that delete product button, we want to make sure that they have the necessary privileges to be able to delete a product. And so the reason we can't just handle all of this logic in the front end is because that would mean it exists in the user's browser. And basically, if something exists in the browser, then that means anyone can edit it. So if in our app, only admins were able to delete products, if all of this existed on the front end, if I had enough technical know-how to go into the dev tools and edit things, I could go into the dev tools, give myself the necessary privileges to delete a product, and I would then be able to press this button and delete a product, even though I wasn't actually an administrator. So we need this core separation where not everything exists in the browser, so we can enforce core security rules. Now, for our use case, Cursor will be interacting with both the front end and also with the back end. Now, when it comes to the front end and back end, there's usually different programming languages you use for the front end and what you use for the back end. There's various different languages, but for our use case, we'll be using React for the front end. Again, various different languages exist out there. I recommend using React, and the template we installed uses React. And the reason I recommend using React is because it's one of the most popular front-end languages that exist out there. And because of that, AI has a huge amount of training data on React, so it can build using React very well. And for the backend, we'll be using Convex. Now, backends are a funny thing in the modern day because most people don't code their own backend. And what I mean by that is, unlike the front end where we're using React to code it from scratch, when we use Convex, Convex isn't a programming language. Convex is basically a backend tool that under the hood uses some kind of programming language, but we don't have to use that raw programming language. Traditionally, people would code their own backends using a raw programming language. However, there's so many things you have to get right, and the backend is so critical in terms of handling data securely and handling user authentication securely, that in the modern day, it usually makes a ton of sense to use a backend out-of-the-box tool like Convex. And the other nice thing about using these out-of-the-box backend tools in the world of AI is they usually expose ways for AI to interact with them. So in the case of Convex, it exposes a bunch of ways AI can go into it and interact with it on our behalf. So AI can very easily see what data exists in our database in Convex. It can add data if it needs to. It can set up functions to edit and utilize data. It could set up authentication. It can do a bunch of stuff very easily. So it makes a ton of sense to use an out-of-the-box backend tool like Convex. One, because AI can interact with it well. And two, a lot of the things that we definitely want to work, like data security and authentication, is already handled for us, for the most part. Now, lastly, before I move on from this, I do just want to make a note of Supabase. Now, if you're in the world of developing apps, you've probably heard of Supabase before. And if this is your first time or one of your first times building applications, you might be asking yourself, well, why choose Convex over something like Supabase? And that's a very valid question. Now, to be honest, a lot of the times when it comes to choosing a backend just comes down to personal preference. However, the reason I very much prefer to opt with Convex in the world of AI development over something like Supabase is because of how AI can interact with Convex versus how it interacts with Supabase. Now, this will be most illustrated when we actually install Convex, and you see what I mean. But basically, when we install Convex, all of the code of Convex, and what I mean by the code is the database and all of our functions and all the logic we have in Convex to handle our business logic securely, that will exist in this repository. And the very nice thing about that is, from my experience, if it exists in this repository and every piece of code exists as a file here, AI can interact with it and get context of it way better than it ever can with something like Supabase. Because in the case of Supabase, the way AI right now interacts with Supabase is it has to use an MCP, and I'll explain what MCPs are in the next step. But essentially what it means is that every time AI, so let's say, for example, Cursor, every time Cursor wants to either get context of what exists in Supabase or edit Supabase in some way, shape, or form, Cursor can't just go directly into Supabase and do exactly what it needs to. It's reliant on Supabase to, one, expose the necessary thing that it needs, and then two, Supabase sending it back in the way Cursor expects. Again, I'll explain what MCPs and tools are straight after this. However, when it comes to Convex, because all of the Convex code lives in our core repository, then Cursor can just go straight in and do exactly what it needs to without any kind of middleman involved. So with front-end and back-end covered, as mentioned, that leads me on nicely to what MCPs are and what tools are. So unless you've been living under a rock in terms of AI, you've probably heard of MCP before. And MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. And all this really means is MCPs are a clean way to give AI access to external services. So if you have an MCP can do various things, but for the most part, it exposes tools. And so the reason MCPs make it easy for AI to use external services is you can have an external service, and that external service can expose a bunch of tools, and the AI can then say, okay, I want to interact with this MCP, look at all the tools it has access to, and then use those tools as and when it needs to. So for example, you might have a Google Calendar MCP, and that MCP, so you can interact with Google Calendar, would expose a bunch of tools related to Google Calendar. So if you gave your AI access to the Google Calendar MCP and you said to it, hey, go create an event in my Google Calendar, it would say, okay, I have access to the Google Calendar MCP. What tools do I have access to? And which is most applicable to what I need to do? Okay, the user has asked me to create an event. I can see I have access to this create event tool. So I'm going to use this tool to create an event. Or if you were to say, hey, AI, what events do I have coming up in my Google Calendar today? Again, it would say, okay, I have access to the Google Calendar MCP. These are the tools I have, which is most applicable to what the user has asked me to do. Okay, they've asked me what events there are in their calendar today. So list events is probably the best tool for this. So AI would then call that tool and then give you the result or use the result in some way. More often than not, when AI works with MCPs and tools, it chains tool calls. So for example, if I was to say, hey, AI, delete the third event in my calendar today, it would first say, okay, I need to delete event in Google Calendar MCP. It would say, okay, there is this delete event tool, but I don't know which event is the third event. So I first need to figure that out. So it would say, okay, let's use list events first. It would get the data from list events, look at that data, say, okay, this is the third event in the day, and then make the tool call to delete event to say, delete this third event that it got in the calendar. So MCPs are really powerful, and most of their power comes from chaining tool calls. But you don't necessarily need to worry about chaining calls because AI will usually figure out how to do this and that it needs to do this on its own. And so just to reinforce the point I was making around Supabase is that Supabase has an MCP and it has a bunch of different tools. So get schema, for example, get functions, create function, all these different tools. But for Cursor to interact with Supabase, it has to use its MCP and then use its tools, which, don't get me wrong, usually works pretty great. However, across the course of building a production-grade app, you'll have to interact with Supabase thousands of times. And although MCPs are great, if you can give AI access to the raw code like you can with Convex, then AI will pretty much always get better context and make better edits if it can do so directly with the raw code, as opposed to having to rely on using an MCP and then using the tools that the MCP exposes. Okay, with MCPs and tools covered, let's cover what Convex is and how we can install it. So for this, I will go on the Convex site. So again, go on your browser of choice, and it is this probably first link, convex.dev. And you'll see a bunch of code here, but again, don't worry about this. AI will be doing all of this heavy lifting for us. What we really care about is what Convex can do for us. So I'm going to hover developers, go on to documentation, and the reason I'm going to go here is just so you can see the features of Convex. So Convex basically has all the things we would want for a backend. So it has functions. All functions are basically a way for us to run logic in the background. So for example, we can run queries. All a query is it allows us to search our database to retrieve information from it. We can perform mutations. A mutation is basically a way to edit data in the database in some way. So edit a record or delete a record. And it can do various other things. I won't go through each because you don't need to understand each, because AI will handle all of this for us when we ask it to set up a certain feature. We obviously have a database as mentioned, so we can store data and we can store it in a structured way. And there's a bunch of other cool stuff like real-time, so we can have a real-time data sync between our front end and the database. Stuff like file storage, scheduling, so we can run scheduled tasks to do certain things. But the last main one I will cover is authentication. And now, like how the backend had various different service providers, so Convex, Supabase, various different others exist, the same is true for authentication. So in the world of web development, there's various different authentication service providers. And what I mean by authentication is basically letting a user sign up and sign in. That's pretty much the most basic explanation of authentication. And although it seems simple at a glance, authentication isn't an easy thing to manage because you need to figure out how you're going to handle user sessions and secure those user sessions. Maybe you want to allow people to sign up or sign in with Google and GitHub and Facebook and all these different services. And doing that yourself isn't the most straightforward thing in the world, which is why various different authentication providers exist. So in this authentication folder in the Convex docs, you can see there's Convex Auth, and this is basically Convex's out-of-the-box way to handle authentication. And this is what we'll use because I think it's perfectly good for most applications. But they then mention a bunch of other potential authentication providers. So like Clerk, same for Work OS, same for Auth0. Each have their own pros and cons. However, as mentioned, we'll be using Convex Auth because it's perfectly good for most business applications, and because it exists in the Convex ecosystem, we don't have to worry about having another tool in the mix. And so now before we can install Convex, we need to create an account. So we can click Dashboard in the top right, and we'll then be prompted to sign in, but I don't have an account, so I can press Sign Up. I will continue with Google. I will be brought to the dashboard, and I'm just going to create a project, and I will call this test app and press create. Here you can choose whatever region you want your server to be in. A project will now be created. I'm not going to touch anything else. I just wanted to set this up so I can now go back into Cursor, and when I install Convex, I can hook it up to this project. And so now, back in Cursor, we can install Convex. So the first thing we're going to want to do is press this cog icon in the top corner, click Settings, and in the center panel here, you will now have a bunch of different settings that you have access to. And you'll want to click Plugins here, and then click Browse Marketplace. Now, what plugins are in Cursor is they basically let you integrate different external services with your project. Here you can see we have a list of all of the available plugins, and one of them is Convex, so I can click into Convex, and here it tells me everything that comes with this plugin. So at the top here, you can see we have skills. These are basically things that the AI can utilize whenever it wants to interact with Convex in a certain way. So for example, if it wanted to create a function inside of Convex to handle some of our business logic, it could look at the function creator skill, look at how Convex expect queries and mutations and different things to be formatted and structured, so it can then go and correctly create that function. We then have subagents. These can be quite handy for certain use cases. So for example, a Convex reviewer. So once the AI has created some kind of backend code in Convex for us, we could use the Convex reviewer to go in and review that code. We then have rules, and rules are exactly as they say they are. So for example, there is an authentication checks rule that comes with the Convex plugin, and it says implement authentication checks in all public functions. So whenever we have AI create a function that's public, this rule will always enforce that the AI has some kind of authentication checks to that function. Rules can be very handy. We'll be creating some custom rules in a later step very shortly. We then also have a Convex MCP, but this won't be too relevant for our use case because the AI will primarily be interacting with these at the top and editing the code strictly in our repo. We then have hooks. You don't need to worry too much about what these are. They tend to be quite advanced features, but essentially what a hook is it's an event. So when a certain thing happens, that will fire an event, and AI or whatever it might be can then react to that event. The hook is before shell execution, so you don't need to worry too much about what shell execution is, but basically what it's saying is that before shell execution, this hook will fire, aka this event will fire, and if we need to do something before shell execution, then we can do so using this hook. Now to install this, we just need to press add in the top right, but before I do that, I do just want to spend a few minutes explaining the skills, subagents, and rules. So Convex gives us access to these skills, subagents, and rules. And just so you know, these are things that are specific to Cursor. So if you've heard of Claude Code, which you probably have, Claude Code has something called a claude.md file. And in claude.md, you can basically give what I would call a bunch of rules to Claude. So if you wanted it to build a certain way, if you wanted it to maintain a certain design system, do whatever, you could stick all of that inside of claude.md. And essentially, whenever you prompt Claude, this file would get passed to Claude every time inside of your prompt. And so obviously if you include instructions inside of this file, since it gets passed in all of your prompts, Claude would follow those instructions. And so Cursor's rules feature is basically their substitution for claude.md. Now these rules won't get applied in every single prompt you make. They'll be applied in different cases. You'll see how that works once we get into rules specifically. However, just know that rules are very much like the claude.md file if you've interacted with Claude or Claude Code at all. We then have skills, and these are similar, if not identical, again, to what you have in the Claude/Claude Code world. So in the world of Claude, these are also known as skills. Now, when it comes to subagents, I'm honestly not too sure what the equivalent of these are in the world of Claude/Claude Code. However, it doesn't really matter. And the reason it doesn't really matter is because the point I'm trying to make is that all this stuff will exist in Claude/Claude Code. And not only will it exist in the Claude world, but it will exist in pretty much every AI development tool that is on the planet. And the reason for that is that all of these things are pretty much just prompts. So for example, all skills is a prompt. The function creator, all that is a prompt that explains how to properly create functions. If I again go on this screen in Cursor and click on the function creator skill, it will open this up in GitHub. It will then show you what exists inside of this skill, and all it is a prompt at the end of the day. It's just a page of text that explains how to create Convex functions. There's nothing special about it. It's just some text with examples of functions, and then at the very bottom, a checklist to ensure you followed best practices. Same for subagents. If I was to go into the Convex reviewer subagent, again, All this is a page of text. It's basically a prompt. It explains you're a code reviewer specialized in Convex development. It then gives a checklist of what you should check. It then gives some examples. At the end of the day, it's just a prompt. And then finally, if I click on a rule, you can probably guess what we're going to see. And no prizes for guessing, it's just a prompt. So it has an explanation with an example. The reason I make this point is because I just wanted to illustrate that I think in the world of AI right now, and especially AI development, things are made out to be way more complex than they actually are. A lot of the new features that you see from these AI platforms are basically just prompts, but spun out with a special name and to be used with a certain use case. In the case of skills, the nice thing about skills is the AI will know when it needs to do something, and so it'll go in search of that skill. But if you had created a prompt that was the exact same as function creator, when you wanted AI to create a function, you could have fed it that prompt yourself. Likewise for the subagents, when the AI wants to do something so it knows it needs to review the code that it's created, it can go looking for the available subagents and say, oh, I've got a subagent that can review my code. But again, this is the exact same thing as you taking what's in the Convex reviewer prompt and passing that prompt manually to AI and asking it to review the code. Same for rules. Again, we could have just taken what's inside of this prompt and manually gave it to AI inside of our own prompts. These are ultimately all just prompts. However, they make our life easier because we can create them once and we don't need to figure out when we need to give them to AI. The AI will essentially figure out itself when it needs to use it. So with that covered, let's now install Convex. And so now back in Cursor, we can press add to cursor for the Convex plugin in the top right-hand corner. Here you have an option to add it for yourself or add it to the project. What this basically means is you can add it for your entire Cursor account, so any future repositories you have. The Convex plugin will also be added to those repositories, or you can add it just to this project, so just to this repository, which I'm going to select. That will then install the plugin to our repository, but there's still a bit of a setup we need to do to fully integrate Convex, because all the plugin gives us is all of these things, so the skills, subagents, rules, etc. It doesn't actually connect Convex to this repository, so we now need to do that. And how I'm going to do it is I'm going to ask AI to do it for me. And so in Cursor, you have a chat panel, and within the chat panel, there's two different selectors here. So this first selector allows you to choose between the modes of the AI. So there's agent, plan, debug, and ask. We'll go through all of these in detail shortly. For now, you just need to concern yourself with the agent mode. And what the agent mode basically means is that when we're in agent mode, the AI will take actions on our behalf. So it will read and write files essentially. And there's then this selector, and this selector allows you to choose which model you want to use. Now, as I mentioned before, if you're on Cursor's free plan, you'll be restricted to just use the auto mode. And what the auto mode does is it essentially just chooses the most cost-efficient model. However, if you're on a paid plan, you have access to choose whichever model you like. And there's plenty more models than just the default ones you'll see when you first install Cursor and open this selector. And you can see all of the available models by pressing Add Models at the bottom, and you can then toggle on whatever models you want to utilize. My favorite ones are GPT 5.3 Codex and GPT 5.2. GPT 5.4 is good, but I haven't seen much of an improvement over 5.2 or 5.3 Codex to warrant the cost difference and how much more expensive GPT 5.4 is. And Opus 4.6 from Anthropic is amazing. It just costs a hell of a lot of tokens, so I prefer to use it sparingly. And if you're ever curious of the different costs of these models, you can type in Cursor models in your browser and you'll see this page, models and pricing from the Cursor docs. And in this doc near the top here, you have the model pricing table and you can press show more models. And here you have a full list of all of the pricing for those different models. Now, all these different prices can be a bit confusing at a glance, but the main ones you'll need to concern yourself with are the input cost and the output cost. The input cost is essentially what you pass in your prompt and any other context the AI takes in from different rules and skills and other context in the conversation up to that point. And the output cost is whatever the AI outputs. So for example, if you ask it to create a page of code, that page of code that it outputs will make up the output cost. Now, knowing how much your prompt is going to cost in terms of the input cost and then estimating how much the output cost will be is very complex. In terms of looking at these models and just understanding their prices, it's easiest to just look at them, look at their inputs, look at the outputs, and compare them between models. So for example, I can see GPT 5.3 Codex, its input cost is $1.75 and its output is $14. And if I look at Claude 4.6 Opus, I can see its input is $5 and its output is $25. So I can see that its input cost is over double that of what GPT 5.3 Codex's input cost is, and its output cost isn't double that of Codex, but it's pretty close. And so as you're using Cursor, you'll see in real time how much of your paid plan you're using, and from that you can kind of start to get a gauge on how much these different models are costing you. So for example, if you use 5.3 Codex and you can see over the course of a day, you've got, I don't know, 10% through your plan usage, then you can guesstimate that, okay, if I would have used 4.6 Opus instead, I probably would have used around double that of my plan's usage. It's not that straightforward, but it's the simplest way to get a grasp of things. Now, every model has its own use case, and each one you'll get a different vibe from, if you like. So for example, Gemini 3.1, I find this is best for visual things, like if you just want to generate pure designs. Same for the Claude models like Sonnet and Opus. These tend to do better with visuals and designs than any of the GPT models do. However, I recommend you experiment with all these different models because Cursor makes it so easy to try different models. Because for me personally, I just stick to GPT 5.2 and 5.3 codecs, and I tend to use 5.2 if I need to generate designs. And for me, I've never once thought they were so horrendous that I need to switch to a different model. So a lot of this, to be honest with you, just comes down to your own preferences. So I recommend experimenting. And so now in Cursor, I am going to click into the chat, and I'm going to ask Cursor to set up Convex for me. So in my prompt, I'm literally just going to ask it to add Convex to this repository because I want to use it as a backend. And I'm going to explain that I have an existing project in Convex that I want to use. And I'm going to use GPT 5.3 codecs for this. So when you're ready, you can simply press submit. So in real time, you will see Cursor working. So you'll see a bit of its thought process, and you'll then see what it's doing in terms of the actions. So you could see there, and you can see again, it's searching files, exploring files, and then reading files. And whenever Cursor wants to take an action, so here it wants to run this in the terminal, it will ask you for permission first. And so here it's asking me for permission to run this in the terminal. Now in our use case, we're going to be very reliant on AI, and AI is going to have to make a ton of changes on our behalf. So it will get quite tedious if we have to approve each and every one of these. So what I'm going to do is I can click these three dots in the corner, and I can just click run every time. And so this will mean when Cursor wants to take an action on my behalf, it doesn't need approval. Now we need to be a bit careful with this. And the reason we need to be careful with this is because the AI is going to have direct access to our backend. So it will have direct access to Convex, which means it can make edits to our database. However, to safeguard against this, we could soon set up rules. So we could set up a rule that says never in any shape or form make a change to the database without prior approval. And that rule could get applied with every single prompt. So we are able to add safeguards if needed. So the AI is done, and it will always give you a plain text summary of what it's done and the potential next steps. So for example here, it says there's some manual steps I need to take. So for example, I need to run npx convex dev to complete that setup of linking my Convex project to this repository. Now, before we do run this, there's one quick thing I want to explain regarding Convex. What I want to explain is that this is obviously the command we were given to run, but the key thing I want us to focus on is the dev. Now, the reason this is so important is that in Convex, you have two key environments, production and development. Now, the reason this is so important is that in the world of web development, it doesn't matter too much for when we're just getting started and we don't have any users. But when we do have users, the last thing we want is to make a change to our production database while users are using that application with our production database. And so it's vital that we have some kind of development database. So when we're developing new features and working on the application, if we were to alter the data in some way, we don't inadvertently impact the experience of users in production. So when we were given this command of npx convex dev, what it means is we're now setting up this development environment for Convex. And when our application is ultimately ready to deploy to the World Wide Web, at that point is when we will set up the production version of our Convex backend. So with that said, now back in Cursor, we can finish that setup. Now I'm actually going to get rid of this panel with all the files just because there's very little times when we'll need it for now. So I will just toggle it off. And I'm actually going to maximize the chat. So I'm going to click these three dots and click maximize chat. So it now takes up the full window. And so we've been given this npx convex dev command, and we need to run this in the terminal. So I'm just going to copy it. I'm going to open up a new terminal window. And then in here, I am going to paste that command and press enter. I'll then be asked if I wish to create a new project or choose an existing project. In my case, I have that existing project, so I want to choose that. So I'm going to press the down arrow key to navigate to that option and press enter to confirm my selection. It will then automatically detect that project that we set up. So here is detected that test app project that I have already set up in Convex, and that is the one I want. So I will just type a capital Y to confirm it and then press enter. And so that is now all set up. So we've now covered what Convex is and how to install it. So let's now discuss what those different modes of cursor were. And now for this step, to properly show you some of those modes, I'm actually going to jump ahead a little bit. So this step we had later on of how to preview our app, I'm actually going to do that now so we can visit our application and use it. And I can then show you in real time how to practically use those different modes of cursor when you're editing and using your application. So now back in cursor, I'm just going to open up a new terminal window. So I'm going to press this plus button to open up a new terminal window. And what I'm going to type is pmpm space run space dev. What this essentially is npm space run space dev. Now we discussed npm earlier, and npm was Node Package Manager. That was the big library of integrations that have different things we can add to our project. Now pmpm is the exact same thing, it's npm. It's simply just a smaller, more efficient, optimized version of npm. And this template comes with pmpm setup. So since it has pmpm setup and pmpm is a slightly more optimized version of npm, I'll stick with pmpm. And then the commands run dev, what this means is that we want to start the development server. So to preview our application, we need a way to run that locally on our machine. And what that means is we need to start a development server on our machine. So whenever you want to test your app before we've deployed it, so you make a change in cursor and you want to test that in real time, you need to do so locally on your machine. So you need to have the application running just on your machine and you can then access it that way. And that's what this command does. It starts that development server. And so I can press enter to run this. And so you'll then get this local host link and you can simply just copy this and you can now open this in your browser. But what I like to do with it is actually open it directly in Cursor's browser. So you can click the three dots here, you can click open browser, and then in this top URL bar, you can paste in that localhost link and you can press enter and you'll now be brought to our application. And to free up some space, you can close the terminal here. Don't worry, it will keep our local version of this running. It will only close this local version that we're running if you press this trash icon on this terminal window. But if you close this entire terminal display itself, it won't actually shut it down. So we can close this to free up some space. And we now have our application that we can click around in. And so let's now preview the different modes available in Cursor. Now, depending on your preferences, I mentioned before, you can press these three dots and maximize the chat. Like so, however, you then obviously can't see the preview of the application. So depending on the way you want to do this, you can have them side by side. So I can click those three dots again and click maximize chat again, and it will bring it back into view. Or if you would like the maximum chat, but still have some kind of preview, you can maximize the chat on one screen, and then on your other monitor, you can have the preview of the application. Because as mentioned, you don't actually have to run this URL inside of Cursor. You could copy this, take it into your browser, and quite literally just paste in the URL, and you can access it that same way. So it's up to you how you want to do it. I personally, for now, I'm just going to preview it in Cursor and use the chat on the other side. And how I will demo these different modes is on the sign-in page. So for now, I'm just going to switch back to light mode like so, and I am then going to sign out so I can get taken back to the sign-in page, and here we are. So the first mode is agent mode. We've already used this for the Convex setup there, where it edited some files on our behalf. And so you can use agent mode whenever you want the AI to take actions on your behalf. So editing files, creating new files, deleting files, etc. There is a bit of a nuance with agent mode because you can actually ask it questions and it won't take an action. It will just respond to your question, which is a bit of a weird thing because there is obviously a dedicated ask mode, but I'll address this little caveat once we've gone through all the different modes. So that is agent mode. And if we switch to plan mode is a very interesting one because if you want to make quite a large change and you want to plan for those changes beforehand, you can obviously use this plan mode. And why this is super helpful is that when you get a bit further down the line in your application and you have different pieces of logic set up, you really do not want the AI to, one, either make a change to a new piece of logic, but at the same time, edit a different piece of existing logic, which then might ultimately break it or change how it works in an unexpected way. And second is that if you were implementing a new feature, there might be many different pieces of that feature. So you might have a page here, a page there, maybe on those pages, there's different popovers, etc. And so using plan mode for that big feature is super helpful because before AI goes off and builds everything, you can see what it is planning to do for those different parts of the feature. So maybe you put it into plan mode and you ask it to do something and all is good apart from this middle page, let's say. And so you can tweak that, perfect that page or what it plans to do for that page. And only once you're happy with the entire user flow of a new feature, will it then go off and implement it. So let's use plan mode now. Let's say I wanted to have a sign in with Google button on our sign in page. Now the setup of that is quite complex. It's easy to just add the button, but having all the backend logic to handle Google SSO is not a simple thing. So this is a good use case for plan mode, and we can see what kind of plan Cursor, and in this case, GBT, gives us back. And the very nice thing about plan mode is that it will very often ask you clarifying questions instead of just making assumptions. So here, for example, it's detected in our app that there's a couple of different sign-in pages. So it wants me to clarify which of those pages I want this change to take effect on. And so I could choose one of these options. I will ultimately choose option A here for this sign-in page. However, if none of these were correct, I could click this other option and type in some kind of custom answer and press enter, and it could use my custom answer. However, as said, I'm going to delete this and instead choose option A. And here it's asking me a bit of a technical question, but the long and short of it is it's asking me what authentication provider do I want to use to handle the Google authentication. Now, towards the start of this, I mentioned that there's a ton of different authentication providers out there in the world of web application development. And for this tutorial, we'll be using Convex Auth, but Clerk is a different authentication provider that we could use if we wanted to, which is why it's been suggested here by the AI. And once this plan is put together, I'm not actually going to ask the AI to build it. I just want to show you what the plan looks like. So for it to be a practical plan, I'm going to choose Convex for the authentication flow because that is what we will ultimately use. So I can select that option, and then once I've selected an option for all of the questions, I can press continue. Once it has all the context it needs, you'll see a little UI like this where it is now writing that plan. And if I was to click view plan, you can see in real time it being created. And as soon as I said that, it was completed. So you can see at the top here, the general written plan. So it said it's going to set up the Convex authentication, add some required environment variables, which are basically just keys to authenticate with different service providers, and then other implementation steps here, and then some other written steps. Now, in the case of Google SSO, implementing this requires a lot of technical knowledge, which is why it's used a lot of techie jargon, let's say, in its implementation plan. However, if you're ever unsure exactly what something in the plan means from a technical perspective, and you want it broken down into simpler terms, you can ask the AI to do that. So while I'm in plan mode here, I'm literally just going to respond and say, this plan is good, but also give me a very basic broken down layman version. And so it's created another plan here. So I will just close this and then open this one it has given me. And you can see here underneath it, it's now just given me a plain English breakdown of these steps. So it first needs to add the Convex authentication file, sign in with Google securely. It then needs to document what we put in the environment files. So where we store those tokens I mentioned, and doing so it ensures it works with our machine and then ultimately in deployment. And then also the rest of the steps, it's broken down into plain English. And still, if there's steps that you aren't sure on and it's not broken down enough, you could just prompt it regarding those specific steps and ask it to break it down in even simpler terms. And so the very nice thing about plan mode is it will give you these to-dos. Now, the nice thing about these to-dos is I could press build here in the top right corner, and this would now, in this same chat, go off and execute each of these steps one by one. However, what I can also do is I can manually edit this to-do list. So ultimately how plan mode works is when I press build, this will be sent into the chat. The AI will look at its first to-do. It will look at the entire plan to get context of basically what this first step involves at a deeper level. It will complete this step, then go on to the next one, refer back to the plan, get further context on the step, and so on and so forth. And so if I wanted to, I could make some manual adjustments to this plan. So for example, if there was a step I didn't like, then I could literally just delete it from the plan, like so. If I wanted to, I could add a new step, so I can add a new to-do, and then add whatever step I want. When you press new to-do, it adds it to the bottom, but if you wanted to add it somewhere in the middle, you could just click on the line above, go to the end, and then press enter, and it will create a new to-do underneath. And you can also edit the existing to-dos. So for example, the social button that it adds, maybe I want it to be blue. So you can edit all of these to-dos and the plan that it uses to get context to match whatever your desired requirements are. And you could then build the entire plan. Or if you like, you can run each step on its own. So I could click this to-do, for example, and I could click build in a new agent. Now, whether you should build in a new agent, for me, it depends on a case-by-case basis. The nice thing about building in a new agent is that if you've had the same conversation open for a couple of days and you've been prompting inside of the same conversation for quite a while, there's going to be a huge buildup of different messages in this conversation. And that context can be amazing, but it can sometimes be awful for the AI. And what I mean by that is that if we've been talking about something for the past 2 days with the AI that's completely irrelevant to this feature, so our conversations have been completely irrelevant to Google Auth, or we might have been discussing something that could even potentially lead it astray. If we were to build this plan in this same conversation, then when it goes to take those steps, if it was to take in the past 2 days of conversation as context, it might be detrimental. However, I've found that this is quite often a rarity. More often than not, the best way to go is to simply just build the entire plan in the same conversation, because most of the time, conversation you've had in the past will help give it context. However, if you're in a situation where you would rather build it in a new agent, because you think this current conversation might actually give poor context, then as I say, you can select whatever to-dos you want and build those in a new agent. And when you do so, it will quite literally just open a new chat and build it in that new chat. And so that is plan mode. And now let's discuss debug mode. And so now for debug mode, I need something to actually be broken. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in a new chat and put it into agent mode and actually ask AI to break something, so we can then go in a different chat and try and get a different AI to fix that thing we broke using debug mode. So I've got a prompt to literally just tell it to break the email input, so I can then go in a different agent and test the debugger. Okay, so it says it's broken it. It says I shouldn't be able to type in the email field anymore. So if I click on the email field and then type, super. I am trying to type right now and nothing is happening. So if I was to open up a new chat here and I was to put it into debug mode, what I can do is I can tell it the issue that I'm having, and it will then add logs to the application so it can monitor and pinpoint what the problem is. And based on those logs, it can come up with some hypotheses as to what the problem might be. And it will either then implement a fix and then ask you to test that fix, and or it will add new logs to confirm its hypothesis and then just continue in that loop until you can confirm that it has fixed the issue. So now that it's in debug mode, if I was to ask it to fix the email input, you can see here it said it wants to confirm its hypothesis and add some runtime logs before it then ultimately changes the behavior. So it's added those logs to the code of this sign-in page, and it's said exactly what it's added. And here in real time, you can see those debug logs. And so here it's giving me some steps that it wants me to take so it can reproduce that issue with the logs. So first it said that I should reload the page and then type something into the email field and try submitting it. And then depending on whether or not the issue is fixed, I can press mark as fixed if it is fixed. And if it's not fixed, I can press proceed so it can look at the logs and then try and further determine what the issue might be. So I will refresh the sign-in page. I will then try typing into the email input, and it is not working. And you can see in real time as I'm trying to type, it does actually add more things to the debug logs. So it's added those logs to try and detect the problem. However, it has not fixed the problem, so I won't press mark as fixed. I will instead press proceed so it can look at those logs and try and determine what the true issue is. Okay, so it's made another change and it believes it has fixed the error. And so it's given me steps again. So it said restart the page, type something in the email, try and submit it, and then again, tell it if it has worked or not. So I can click on the email input, try and type something, and it has indeed worked. So now, because it has worked, I can press mark as fixed. And what this means is it will now go through and remove all of those debug logs that it added and clean things up. And there we go. It has removed all of those logs, and the issue we ultimately had at the start is now fixed. So if you've tried a few times to fix an issue with the agent mode, but it just can't seem to fix it, that is really where debug shines. It can be super powerful in those situations. And then lastly, if I open up a new chat, we have the ask mode. And as it says here, you can use ask mode to ask Cursor questions about your code base. And this can be super useful because you can ask it technical questions or you can ask it very non-technical questions, so it can break down complex code into some kind of human readable explanation. So for example, this sign-in page is not yet truly hooked up to any kind of authentication provider. So when I try and sign in with an actual email address and password, nothing truly happens. And so before we do make a change and set something up, let's see how the logic is currently set up. So I could ask that question. And it will give you a complete explanation of whatever you asked it. So here it said the sign-in page is currently just using a mock authentication flow because it's not actually hooked up. And it's then given us a full breakdown of the current logic. However, this explanation is extremely technical. And so similar to how we did with plan mode, if we wanted this to be broken down into simpler terms, we could ask it to do so. So I could just respond, explain this in very basic non-technical terms. And it then will give us a very handy, completely non-technical explanation of what's going on. Now I mentioned that there's a bit of a caveat with agent mode because you can ask it questions. And what I mean by this is if I was to put it back into agent mode and I was to ask agent mode a question, and when I ask it a question, I make it very clear that it's a question by phrasing it like a question and then putting a question mark at the end, it will just respond with text and it won't take an action. And I'm actually going to do this in a new chat just in case it was to look at the conversation history and kind of take a biased view and not take actions because it sees I was asking questions before. So if I was to ask it a question, like how does the sign-in page work with a question mark at the end? And again, I'm in agent mode currently. As you can see, it just responded with text. It didn't take any actions on my behalf. So I've actually stopped using ask mode entirely. If I want to ask a question, to be honest with you, I just ask it in agent mode and make sure that I phrase the question very evidently in a way that the AI obviously knows it's a question. So saying something like how or what, and making sure I put a question mark at the end, because as you see, it will just respond with text and not take any actions. And just doing it all in agent mode for me makes my life a bit easier than having to switch between modes. However, if you want to be ultra precise with your modes, just know that ask mode is there and you can use it whenever you want. So we've now covered the different modes of Cursor, and let's now cover what rules are in Cursor. So in Cursor, if you click the cog in the top corner and then click settings, in here you can click rules, skills and subagents in this panel, and you'll then see all of your different rules, skills and subagents. Now we already have a bunch of these, and the reason we have a bunch of these is because these came with the Convex plugin that we installed. And similar to what we saw on that plugin screen where we could see all the rules, skills and subagents, we can click into one, and you don't see it in the biggest view, but we can expand it here and you can see basically what is inside of this rule. And if you would like, you can do the same with the skills and the subagents. And when it comes to the rules, we can control when these rules get applied to the AI. So for these Convex rules that came with the plugin, we can see here they are set to apply intelligently. And if we click into one and expand it out again, we can see here the content of the rule, so what actually is the rule. But then at the very top, we have some metadata about the rule. And what I mean by metadata is we have a short description of it, but we then have when it should be applied. So here we have what's called the globs. What it basically means is this rule should be applied whenever the AI is interacting with .ts. This means TypeScript, so it's just a type of file, a type of language, and then .js, again, a JavaScript file. Whenever it's interacting with a TypeScript file in the Convex folder or a JavaScript file within the Convex folder, this rule should be applied. And because of this configuration, if it's editing a TypeScript file in the Convex folder or a JavaScript file in the Convex folder, that means it's interacting with Convex, and thus we want this argument validation rule that describes how to work with arguments in Convex to be applied, because we know that it's interacting with a Convex file. And so the nice thing about this is that if I press cancel, we can create our own rules. So I could press new at the top here, and I can then choose if it's a user rule or a project rule. If you choose a user rule, this means it will be applied to your entire Cursor account and be applied to all of your future repositories. If it's a project rule, it will just be applied to this project/repository. So for this, I'm going to choose project. And so here I could create it manually, so I could give it a name, describe the rule. I could then here describe when it should be applied, so always applied or applied to specific files and folders. And similar to the Convex example, I could then choose what files I want it to be applied to. However, the easiest way is to create it with an agent. So to create a rule with AI. So I'm going to choose create with agent. It will open up a new chat here with a pre-populated prompt. And the rule I'm going to create is the one I mentioned before, where I don't want the AI to edit my Convex database in any way without prior permission. And so I can describe to AI that rule and it will create it for me. And like plan mode, it will probably ask you clarifying questions. So here it's asked me when it should be applied. So I'm going to say only to Convex files. And in a situation like this, you might not be too sure what you should actually recommend. And if you're ever in that situation, you can honestly just ask AI what it should do. Great, and so that is done. So you could either click onto it here and we can see it in this UI that we saw before, or you can click onto the file here. And for me, this is just a bit more readable. And you can see the rule that has been created. Now in Cursor, whenever AI makes a change, you can reject that change or you can approve that change. So here you can see we have all of this text, and this text is in a green box. And we call these boxes a diff, so short for difference. Now, why we have these is because we could have an entire file of code. So let's say we have all our different lines here. Let's say AI then goes and makes a change to this file. And when it does so, it adds a new line of code at the very top here. Because that code is an addition, it will be marked with one of those green boxes that we saw with that green highlighting in the background. And let's say when the AI made the change, not only did it add the code at the top here, but it also deleted this line of code here. Well, whenever the AI has done that, afterwards, we would still see this line of code. However, it would be marked with a red box and a red highlight behind it. And again, we call these things diffs, aka differences. And the nice thing about having these diffs is that we can reject or keep them at a code by code individual difference level. So here for now, this isn't the best example because all it's done is add code and it's just only added one big block of code. So I only have one option to undo or keep. But if there was multiple new additions or this was an existing file and it removed certain pieces, for each addition or individual removal, you would have an undo or keep for that specific piece. But for now, as I say, it's just made this one big addition, so I have just the single undo or keep buttons, and so I can press keep. So we've now covered what cursor rules are. Let's cover how to build in cursor. So I will switch back to our app preview tab here, and I'm going to open up a new chat. And we've already covered the agent mode, and I mean pretty much all the building you do in cursor will be done in agent mode. And so building in cursor is pretty much just as simple as putting it in agent mode and giving it a prompt. However, what I mean by how to build in cursor is more so the iteration process. So the first thing we're going to do is update the sign-in page to be hooked up to our Convex backend so we can actually use real authentication and sign in with true email and passwords and real user accounts. And so let's do that. So I am going to prompt the AI to basically say, I want to update the sign-in page to now use my Convex backend and specifically the Convex auth. And it's also then good to specify certain features or next steps around the thing you wanted to implement. Now, exactly what you should specify, there is no hard rule. In truth, it's just something you'll pick up over time. But so in this example, I'm going to specify that after sign-in, the user should be taken to the dashboard page. Because I know the AI, and again, this is just from experience, you'll pick this up over time, but I know the AI probably won't make the assumption to set up the sign-in, but then also set it up so the user gets taken to the dashboard page. And for us, that's a pretty obvious thing. If someone signs in, it's great. They're authenticated and they're signed into their account, but it's useless if they aren't taken to the dashboard. But the AI doesn't think the same way as us. And again, you'll pick up these small little things over time and learn the nuances of it as you go. So the AI is done, but it hasn't actually made any changes. And the reason it hasn't made changes is because of that rule we added before about never editing the database without prior permission. So our rule has worked, which is fantastic, but we obviously need to give the AI permission to do so. So I simply just need to say that it can proceed. So that is now done. The AI has edited a bunch of files, and as usual at the very end here, it's given us a text summary of what it's done. And so it says everything should be set up and good to go. And so as I say, it's edited a bunch of files, and I could go through each of these files and look at the changes that it's done on a change by change basis. However, I trust it, and so I'm just going to press keep all at the bottom here. And if you expand this bottom part, you can see all of the files that have been edited. And so the authentication is now set up, but the problem we have is that we don't have any users in our database. So what I am going to ask it to do is I'm going to create me a user in the database. And because we have that rule that says you can't edit the database without prior permission, I'm going to include in my prompt that I give it permission to do so. So it says it has created that user. I meant for the password to be testing app with 2 P's, but it's 1 P, so I just need to keep that in mind. And if we hop back over to Convex and click on data, we can see here in the auth accounts, there is already that user. And if I just click into users here, you can see that user exists with that email. So it has successfully created that user for me. And so that means now, if I try to sign in with that user, it should work. And so I'm going to type a wrong password in first, just so afterwards, when I type the correct password, I know if it actually is detecting correct passwords. So that is a weird error, but at least it didn't work. And so if I type now testing app, so the real password, It did indeed work. However, I didn't get taken to the dashboard. We have an issue for cursor to fix. Now I could put it into debug mode, but for me debug mode is a bit of a last resort. Usually I'll try 2 to 3 times to have cursor fix the issue on its own in agent mode, and if that doesn't work, I'll then switch it to debug mode. So I can explain the issue and ask cursor to fix it. Great, so it says it has applied a fix, so I can test the sign in again. And again, I am going to type in an incorrect password because I want to see this error so I can grab a screenshot of it. Because once we fix this directing to dashboard issue, I'm going to give that screenshot to cursor to say, make this a human readable error. But for now, we can test if the dashboard routing fix worked. So I can sign in. And again, it is still not working. So I'm going to try and kill 2 birds with 1 stone here. I'll try agent mode once more to fix the dashboard issue. And if that doesn't work, we can switch to debugger. And this sounds absolutely crazy, but if you're ever stuck and the AI just isn't doing what you wanted to do, use capital letters. So at the end here, I am going to scream at it to say, fix this. Don't ask me why, just sometimes it works better. Okay, so it says it has made those 2 fixes, so we can now test them. So I will first test if the error message is now human readable if I enter the wrong password, which it is. Super. Now I now test the big issue of the direction to dashboard not working. So if I sign in, it is still not working. So we now have to bring out the big guns and put it into debug mode. And hopefully this shows you that this is never a perfect process when you're building with AI. There's always going to be this back and forth, and some things won't work on the first attempt. Setting up authentication isn't a simple process, which is why we're caught in this loop now. So when you are caught in a loop like this, just know that these things happen. It can be a bit tedious, but trust me, it just takes a bit of a back and forth and it will get there in the end. And so I'm now going to put it into debug mode, have that back and forth with the AI, and I shall return when it is resolved. Hey, I'm back. The issue is now fixed, so I can sign in and I get taken to the dashboard page. And so let's continue. Now, the next thing I wanted to cover was understanding the different parts of your repository. And I won't go super in depth in this because it involves looking at the code, but it helps to just have a very high level understanding of these different pieces of the repository. So in Cursor, if I open up the panel with all of our files, and I will drag this out a little bit so we can see what we're doing. There is obviously a bunch of files in here, and if this is your first time ever looking at code, it can be quite intimidating. As I say, we're not going to cover the absolute ins and outs. It just helps to have a high level understanding of what's going on. So in your .cursor file, you will have all of your rules. And these are the rules that you've personally created. So here you can see we have that rule that we created earlier about the AI requiring permission to edit the Convex database. So all of our rules live here. We will ignore the .github folder and skip to the Convex folder. Now, I'm not going to go through every single file in here, but the main reason I want to show you this Convex folder is to illustrate the point I made earlier, that the nice thing about Convex is that all of the files of Convex, so all of the files that define what our database looks like in terms of what columns there are and what tables there are, all of the different functions we have to get data and edit data and perform different pieces of business logic, that all will sit inside of this Convex folder. And that is amazing because the AI can access it directly, which means it can very easily get context and make the correct changes. In the public folder is usually where you store your assets, your visual assets, so things like your favicons, the logos of your application. Usually all of your public visual assets will live in this folder. You then have the source folder, and this is pretty much where the core of your application lives. So there's a bunch of folders in here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to illustrate the point that this is pretty much where the core of your application lives. For instance, here in this folder, we have components, and these make up all of the different components in our application. So for example, here you can see we have this sign out dialog component, and there's a bunch of code in here. But basically what this controls is that whenever you sign out, you see this dialog. This is that sign out dialog. So for example, if I changed the title to be sign out now, and I was to, at the top here, go to file and press save to save my changes to the code. If I switch back to the preview, you can see here that text is updated because obviously this sign out dialog is this component, and I will just delete that change and again press save. And then for example, in the features folder, there's a bunch of subfolders. I won't go through them all, but this is where the pages live. So the code that makes up the pages of the application. So the core code of your app, what you see, lives in this source folder. The next file, and it is a very important one and is crucial for security, and I mean hooking up different integrations, is this .environment.local file. And so here we have different things related to Convex that the AI is set up. And just keep in mind that you should never really show anyone your environment file, because usually you'll have very confidential tokens, URLs, keys, whatever it might be, saved within this file. So let's say, for example, you wanted to add some kind of AI chat to your app, and the AI you wanted users to be able to talk to was GBT. So GBT, and GBT is made by OpenAI. Now, to be able to use GBT from an external place, you need to have something that identifies you as a person. So OpenAI knows that you're the one making this call, so they can charge you appropriately for it. And the way you would identify yourself to OpenAI is via an API key. Now, an API key can really be anything, but usually it's just a bunch of random numbers and characters in some kind of unique identifying way. So it's so unique that someone else couldn't guess it and start using your API key. So they could then, in this case, start using GBT, mimicking you as a person, which would then mean you get charged for all of someone else's requests. So how this usually works then is that every time you want to make a request to OpenAI so you can use GBT, in this request that you make, you need to include your API key, because that way OpenAI can know who you are and they can charge you whatever they need to. And so because the API key is a very confidential thing, we need a confidential place to store it. And so that is what environment variables are. And that is what this .env file is. It's where we store those very confidential tokens, keys, URLs, whatever it might be. Moving on, the next one you should be aware of is the package.json. Now in the package.json, this is basically all of the different, let's say, integrations that have been added to our application. So for example, in the dependencies here, you can see all of the different integrations that have been added to the project. So for example, we have Convex auth, Radix UI are components, and these come with that template that we used as the base, which is why we have all of these components. TanStack is a framework, and this again came with a template, and it's just something that makes our life when we're building a bit easier, and AI can work with it well. We have some more components, Lucid React, this is an icon library. You have React, and I mean, this is what the application is built on. It's built on React, which is why we have React in our project. And things like Tailwind CSS that are used to apply styling to elements inside of our application. So essentially, at a high level, you can consider the package.json to be all of the integrations that have been added to your project. And I mean, that's pretty much it. There's a bunch of other files and folders we could go through, but for you to just have enough of a conceptual understanding so you can grasp somewhat of what's going on, and in certain use cases, better direct cursor, that's pretty much all you need to know. And so we've now covered at a high level the different parts of the repository, and we've also already covered how to preview your app. So let's now discuss how to structure your building process. Now back in Cursor, if I just switch back to our preview, and I'm going to get rid of this panel with the code. And what I mean by structuring your build is figuring out what to build first, because there's a million features you can add, there's a bunch of different pages you could build, but it does matter which of those features and pages you build first. Now, if you haven't already, I highly recommend just creating a high-level flow diagram of whatever the process is that you want to build software around. I created a video on how to do this, and there'll be a link to it in the description. And the reason this is so valuable is that when you break it down like this, you can then understand conceptually what the pages of your application should be. So you can see as I was going through this diagram, for each section that required a page, I note it down on the side here. So we needed an orders page to handle this part. We needed an issues page to handle this part. And the amazing thing about this is it allowed me to create a very high level plan of the build. So I was able to say, okay, we need these roles for the app. So we'll need users to be able to be an admin or a sales rep. For the pages, we'll need a sign-in page or a forgot password page. For our orders, we'll need an orders list page, a create orders page, etc. And why this is important is that every page needs to be hooked up to data in some way. So inside of Convex, we'll need to create our database, and that database will store the data that populates these pages. So for example, when it comes down to it, when we create our orders page, these will be orders that have come from our database. On the customers page, these will be customers that have come from our database. And when it comes to databases, so this is our fancy database with our columns and our rows. And let's say this is our orders table in the database. And let's say we also have a products table in our database. Orders are made up of products, but products aren't really made up of anything. What I mean by that is when we're first populating this orders table, we can't really do it if we don't already have our products table populated. Because at the end of the day, orders will just be a bunch of products put together with some information around it, like the total price, who it was that ordered it, the shipping address, etc. But when it comes to the products, we don't really need anything else before we can start creating the products. And so products has pretty much zero dependencies, whereas orders has a bunch of dependencies. In this example, it's reliant on products, but it probably is also reliant on us adding all of our customer information, because if we create our orders and populate it with all of the products that have been ordered, it's kind of useless until we then link that to the customer that ordered it. So orders has a bunch of dependencies, but products does not. And why I highlight this is that when you have a plan like this, it's useful to think through what the underlying data of all these pages would be, because you can then figure out which of those parts of data have dependencies and which don't. And whichever don't have dependencies, you should build those first. So in our example, because products don't have any dependencies, I am going to build the products part of our application first. And so when I titled this, How to Structure Your Building Process, that's ultimately what I meant. When you're building an application, it's best to build the features and pages that don't have any dependencies first. So let's now build those product pages. Now, before we actually build these product pages, I quickly want to change something. So you see at the bottom here, we have this palm tree in the bottom left, and we have this TanStack router badge in the bottom right. And I mentioned as we were going through that package.json file that one of the integrations that had been added to our project was TanStack, and is essentially, again, a framework, and that comes with this template. So whenever we actually deploy this, you won't see this UI in the bottom here. It's only in development that you see it. However, for our testing, I still want to hide this just so I can get a realistic view of what the application looks like. And this template already comes with a bunch of different settings pages. So in this display settings page, I'm going to get AI to add some kind of way to toggle this TanStack UI on and off. And just so it definitely knows what I'm talking about, I'm just going to take screenshots of both of these areas and include those with my prompt. Great, so that is now done, and I can see we have this toggle to control the TanStack UI. So if I toggle this off, that one is hidden, but the left one isn't hidden. If I press update display, the left one is still not hidden, so I'm just going to give it one more prompt to tell it to hide this left one also. Great, that is now done, and if I toggle this on and off, we can see that it's working correctly and showing and hiding it correctly. Now, before we build the products page, there's just one last quick thing I want to do, and it's a very critical step so we can set up the foundations of building in a somewhat secure way moving forward. Now, if you're not technical and you can't verify the code that the AI produces, the two next best things that you can do are: one, get AI to review the code and try and identify any security vulnerabilities in the code. Or two, get the AI to turn the code into some kind of visual diagram or visual description that you can understand in plain English. This is absolutely critical for when it comes to the things that we have in Convex. In Convex, we will have very confidential information. So for example, in Convex, we will store all of our users, and that means in our database, we will have all of the emails of these users. And because we have all of these emails, this is extremely confidential information that we do not want to expose to someone who doesn't have the necessary privileges to see this information. So in this example, data security is ultimately the underlying thing that we want to ensure we protect. But data security isn't just ensuring that we don't expose information such as this. It also means that we don't just allow anyone to make whatever requests they want to the database and perform whatever actions they want. In the example of our products table that we will have in Convex, this table will ultimately store information that is critical to the operations of our business. And so because it's absolutely critical to the business operations, we need to ensure that this person who is making the request to, let's say, add a record or delete a record has the necessary privileges to do so. Because if we don't check that this person has the necessary privileges, then we're basically just allowing anyone in the entire world to make whatever changes they like to our entire database, which will never end well. So we need to add as many things as we possibly can to ensure that our apps are secure. And as I say, if you aren't technical and you can't read the code, then you really have two main options. The first is AI reviews. This can be as simple as having some kind of rule in place so that whenever the AI makes some kind of update to the backend, it reviews that code for security vulnerabilities. Or it can be as complex as having multiple sub-agents fire whenever a Convex change is made. So you basically have multiple points of failure. So you're not relying on just one AI to check things over. You have multiple AIs independent of one another checking things over, so there's just less chance of things slipping through the cracks. And the other way you can verify security is through visuals. And what I mean by visuals are: one, text, and 2, images, or in truth, diagrams. Now, why these visuals can be so useful is that as a non-technical person, code is, well, it is quite literally a different language. However, we understand English, and so we can ask AI to translate the thing we don't understand, so the code, into some kind of plain English explanation of what's going on, so text. And we can also ask it to break it down into images or diagrams. This can be extremely useful for logic, because logic usually follows some kind of step-by-step cadence. So if this, then that, if this, then that, and so on. And diagrams help illustrate this massively. And so visuals can be a great way to verify their security as a non-technical developer. Now, I can't stress enough that neither of these things are a true substitute for going into the code and verifying security via looking at the code. If your business will depend on this software and you have very sensitive information running through it, then I highly, highly recommend you have a developer in your building process so they can do some of their own security checks. However, we will add both of these so we can do as much as we can on our own. Now, I do want to make a note that we're using Convex in this example, and Convex is built using code. However, no code backends do exist. So for example, this is Xano, and in Xano, you can see all of your tables in a no code way. And you can somewhat do this in Convex, but what you can't do in Convex is build logic in a visual way. However, you can do that in Xano. So for example, in Xano, when you're building your logic, you have a bunch of different visual functions that you can add. So if you want to get data from your database, you can perform an action such as this and configure everything in this no-code interface. And if you want the visual experience, then I highly recommend investigating Xano. Xano is by far the best platform out there right now for a no-code backend, and WeWeb will soon also be launching their own no-code backend. So if you will have highly confidential information running through your application and you can't afford to have developers in your building process, then I highly recommend checking out one of those no-code backend solutions so you can ensure that your logic is secure. And if you would like to see a build guide using one of those no-code backend solutions, then let me know in the comments. So let's jump back into Cursor, and to add those security layers that I mentioned in a visual way, I'm going to add a rule. So I'm going to open the cog in the top right, click onto settings, go to rules, skills and subagents, and I am going to add a new rule. And again, this will be a project rule. Now I'm not going to create this one with the agent because I want to be ultra specific with this. And what I'm going to call this rule is backend logic documentation. So essentially what I want to happen is that when new backend logic is created, whether it be some kind of data query or the AI creates a new table or edits a table, I want it to update our documentation on our tables and our logic. And although it doesn't exist yet, how I want it to do this is we'll have a docs folder in our repository. And so whenever something happens, so it creates a new table or adds new logic, it should document the logic and tables in that docs folder. And so in this rule, I'm now going to describe that. So I've written my rule. It says whenever you alter our Convex backend to the tables or the logic, I want to document this in the /docs folder. And if it doesn't yet exist, you can create the folder. And then I've just specified how I want it to articulate that documentation. So I am a non-technical builder, and let me just fix that typo. I am a non-technical builder, so I want your documentation to be beginner friendly. My core goal is to both understand the logic, but also ensure we have the correct authentication checks in place. And what I mean by authentication checks is, for example, in our query to get products, let's say only admin should be able to retrieve products. So in that logic, we want to ensure that there's authentication checks to make sure only an admin is able to do this. And so I will save this. And now that that rule is in place, let's begin building the products page. And so if I just look back at this brief plan I had created beforehand, so we want a products list page and a products details page. So what that basically means is we will have a data grid with our products. And when you click on a product, you will then see a page with detailed information about that respective product. So I'll create a new chat so the AI does not have context of what I was talking about beforehand about the TanStack UI. And so in my prompt, I'm going to articulate that I want a products data grid page with a products detail page whenever I click on one of those products. And I want this to be hooked up to my Convex backend. So it will need to create a table for products, and it will need to create all the associated logic with getting the products and editing them, etc. However, I won't specify anything about what it should do in Convex. It will be able to figure that out on its own. I just need to mention that I want it to hook it up to Convex. And for this, I'm going to use plan mode. This is a good use case for plan mode, especially because we'll be adding something to the backend. More specifically, we'll be creating a new table or multiple tables in our backend to cater for this new feature. And when it comes to tables, it's very important even if you don't know exactly what's going on, to just have a little skim through it to make sure that the table has your needed data fields. So for example, in your business, if products have SKUs or they have expiry dates or something of that nature, you just want to have a quick read through the tables that the AI will create just to make sure that it's accounted for all the information you might have about whatever it is for your business use case. And so I now describe that I want that products page with the products details page, and I want it to be hooked up to Convex. And then lastly, at the bottom here, I'm going to make up some kind of information about my hypothetical business that handles products. But at the bottom, you would just want to specify any contextual information about your business. So what should be in that products data grid and what should be on the product detail page, and any other functionality that may surround it. And just a small thing, this is a personal preference thing, but I just find that GPT 5.2 does a bit better for planning than Codex. Again, just a personal opinion, so I'm going to switch it to 5.2. And here, since I'm in plan mode, it's asking me those clarifying questions, so I'll just give it some mock answers. So that plan has now been created, and if we take a look at it, we have our summary of what will happen. And so here we can see what it's going to do in Convex is it's going to add a new products table. These will be the fields of the table. So these will essentially be the columns of the table. So a SKU and name description, inventory on hand, inventory reserved, status of the product, and then just some time information about when it was created and updated at. We then have indexes. You don't have to worry about this too much, but it basically makes our queries much faster, and it's done on usually a column basis. So for example, it's set one up for SKU, which makes a lot of sense. SKUs will be unique, and so when we search for a product, we probably want to search by SKU very often. And so because we want to search by SKU very often, we can set up an index on the SKU column, which will basically make any searches we do on the SKU column much quicker. Then describe the different functions it will create. So basically what data actions it will have. So here it said it will create a list query. So to return the products, a get to fetch a specific product for that product details page, and then a create to create a product. So here it's added an auth check, and it said all public functions will require this function and throw a clear error if unauthenticated. What this basically means is that to get products or create products, you need to be signed in. Now you might want to go one step further than this and say they need a specific role, which you can obviously do. But here it's just added a base check for if the user is signed in, which I will stick with for now. And then it's described the pages. So it said these are the new routes it will add. A page in technical terms is essentially a route. So when it said these are the routes it will add, it basically means these are the pages it will add. So it's described that, and it's then described how it will hook it up to Convex. And then finally add a products page in the sidebar so we can access it. And lastly here, very good, it has detected that rule we created for documenting changes in Convex. And so it's said here at the bottom, there is a documentation requirement, and because we're changing Convex tables logic, we need to document this in the /docs folder. So to me, this is all good. And so I'm going to switch this to Codex just because I think it is better at building, especially for complex things such as this. And I will press build. And as that is doing its thing, I will switch back to the preview of the app. So that is now done, and like usual, it's given us back a plain text explanation of what it has done. I can see there's an error on the page here, but I probably can just press back to home and get taken back. Nope. Okay, that is never good. And so this is a good time for me to show you a little trick for debugging. So how you do this will be slightly different depending on if you're previewing this in the cursor browser or your native web browser. If you're doing it in the cursor browser, then you can click this second icon here called Show Console. And when this opens up, you can click here for the console. And I won't go through what every single button here does, but the key one that we want to use for now is this one to clear the console. And the console is basically where we can detect errors in the application, usually. So for example here, when I press back to home, I expect to see an error. There we go. And so I can just take a screenshot of this error, put it in the chat and say, I got this error, fix it. Before I send this off, to access this console, if you're using this in your native browser, you will want to just right-click the page, click inspect, and then you can access the console from here, and it's the exact same UI that you see in the Cursor browser. So that is now done. I can press keep all. I can see that I believe it seems to be fixed, and I can click this icon again to hide the console. And so if I now click onto products, that is never good. We have another error. So I can simply just again open up the console. I'm not sure which of these errors it might be, but I'm just going to give literally the whole thing to AI and it will do what it needs to. And so there we go. It has fixed the issue, but we now see there's another error returned by Convex, and it said basically you can't use the function you created, and have you forgot to run either of these? And I just want to illustrate the point that we can just give a screenshot of this and give this to AI and ask it what the problem is and what we should do. And you can continue in this loop if you ever have issues. However, I can see already in the chat that the AI has just suggested that we should run this. So we don't need to ask it anything further. So I will open up a new terminal and I will paste that in the terminal, press enter. We got a confirmation. And so we can test if that's working correctly. So if I click onto a different page and click back onto products, super, that seems like it worked. However, we don't have any data and we can confirm this now. So if we go back into Convex, if we now go to data, we can see we have a products table, but the table is empty. And so we can ask AI to add some mock data to this table so we can visualize it and work with it in the application. And we have that rule that prevents it from making database edits without prior approval. So I just need to approve it. So it says it's done, but I can't see any products data. So let's see if I click off the page and go back onto it. Hallelujah, we have data and we can test the detail page. So if I was to click on a row, I do indeed get taken to the detail page. But what we don't have is a way to edit this information. So I will ask the AI to add some way to edit the information via the detail page. And once again, it needs approval for Convex edits. And so while it is doing its thing, I will just show you now in Convex that in that products table, we can see all of that respective data. And just for context, Convex calls rows of data documents. And also while the AI is doing its thing, I completely forgot to look at the documentation it would have created. So now in this docs folder, we have this products backend file. And here we can see all of the documentation about what it's done. And we can see here the authentication and safety checks that have been applied to the associated logic for products. So we can see here all public product functions, call an internal auth check. So basically we check if the user is signed in, and if they aren't signed in, they can't access the data. And again, you can add as many additional layers of security as you want on top of this. So we could have it restrict to admins or a certain role, or a user could only retrieve data related to them, something of that nature. Great, so that seems to be done. And so if I switch back to the preview and close this repo panel, we can see now we have this edit product button. And so if I click this, all of these fields become editable. And so let's say I want to make the number of products we have on hand here 500. This was the packing tape heavy duty. And so if I save this, the update was successful here. And if I click chat and go back to products, you can see it is still also correct here. And just to confirm, in Convex, we can also see that update has been made. So everything is set up correctly. And that is pretty much how you would go about building in Cursor, going page by page, feature by feature, and with each new thing you build, thinking about what are the dependencies that surround this feature and trying to start with the features that have as little dependencies as possible. And so we've been adding functionality, but how do we edit the designs? Because we can see here we still have this placeholder that comes with the template for shad CN. Same with the colors, it's just a black and white design system for now. Well, all of this is editable and I'll show you how. So there's two visual/no code ways you can edit the designs. The first is you can click this icon when you're previewing the application in the Cursor browser. And here you can actually select any element on the page. So for example, if I wanted to make this search bar bigger, I could click on this element and here this panel opens up. And this is basically the layout tree. So this is the element I selected, and basically elements in web development can have child elements and parent elements. So I could follow this tree up to see all of the parent elements of this search bar, and I could follow it down to see any elements inside of it. So for example, here's the search bar. but inside of it you have an SVG, so it's this search icon. You then have text for the search placeholder. And then this part of the panel, you can actually alter the designs to be whatever you like. So let's say I wanted to make it wider. I could change this value. So let's say I want to make it 350 pixels wide. I can press enter. That will update in real time. And it's a bit weird in Cursor right now because although we've made that change, we still need AI to actually go and apply that change. So you can see here, there's this apply button now. And so when I press apply, it will send my change to the AI, and the AI actually has to make the change on my behalf. So it isn't truly a visual/no-code way to make changes because we need to do it and then give it to AI to make the true change, but it's a nice kind of middle ground. And you can see AI has then made that true change for us. And the other way I like to do this is using a nice little tool called Agentation. So to get to Agentation, you can just visit agentation.com. And when you're on the page, you can actually preview how it works. So you can click this thing, and you can then see we can select any element on the page and give some kind of feedback, press add, and then we could select something else, give some kind of feedback. And then once we've added a bunch of different feedback points, we have some controls at the bottom here. And the very nice one is we have this copy feedback button. And this basically just gives us a nice formatted version of all of the feedback changes that we've requested in a way that we can feed to AI. And so to install Agentation in our app, you can click on install, and they have this installation guide here. And for our use case, we just want to copy and paste up to this part. So up until the code example in add to your app. So I will copy this, and I'm just then going to say to AI, install this, and then paste those docs underneath. Cool, and that's done. And if I come out of this selector mode in Cursor and close this. And so now that we have this button, we can click this and we can select anything in the interface, and we can then request the change and give that to AI. So let's say this top part of the left navigation, don't need this for my app. So I could just say remove this, press add. I could then click on anything else and request as many feedback changes as I like. And once I've requested all of my changes, I can click copy feedback. I could paste it in the chat here, and it just gives me automatically a nicely formatted prompt that I can give to AI. And so AI did its thing, and it is now removed. And the final piece of the designs is the colors. And where these live in the code is in source, in lib, and then in styles here. You can see we have this theme.css file, and I won't explain in great detail what this is, but basically in here we have a bunch of colors. So we have a background color, a foreground color, a card color, and then a definition of what that color should be. And these colors then get used across our app. So the best way to make changes en masse to the colors of our app is to request to AI to create basically some kind of theme based on what we want. So let's say, for example, to have a happy green theme. Let's go with that. So you can see it's went in and edited that theme.css file, and it's probably went a bit overkill on the green, but we can label that as user error on my behalf. And the final thing I'm going to do before we figure out how to deploy this is just to get it to remove that green background, because it is absolutely horrendous. There we go, much better. And the last two steps in all this are, first, what is Git, how you can set it up and install it, and we will then cover how to deploy your application to the World Wide Web. So first, let's discuss Git, how to set it up and how to install it. So GitHub is just basically a place for us to store our code. So when you upload your code to GitHub, it will look something like this. And I mean, this is basically what we have in Cursor, like so. All of these files and folders, but we're just storing it in an online place. And we won't explore them now, but the other cool things about GitHub is that, one, other developers can collaborate with you on your project, and two, it very easily allows for iterations on the product. So what I mean by the iterations is, let's say this is our main application. So this is that repository with all of our code that we have in GitHub. And let's say we wanted to add some kind of order tracking feature. When it comes to adding new features, and this is especially the case when your application is live and you have people using it, you would never want to edit this code base directly, because at the end of the day, you could break it. And if there's people using your app, the last thing you want is to break your live application, and then your users can't use your app. So the nice thing that GitHub allows us to do is to create branches from our application. So for example, I could create a branch, and that branch could be dedicated to the order tracking feature. And maybe it'll take a couple of days to complete this feature. And in the middle, I want to work on some other feature. So I don't know, some kind of new settings page. I have both of these branches and I can work on them as I like. And since they're independent of this main branch, any changes I make in either of these obviously won't affect the main branch and thus won't potentially break it. And the nice thing about the branches is that once you're ready, you can finish all your work and then merge them back into main. So these branches are an amazing feature for iterating on software products because you can work on new features in isolation. And GitHub has a bunch of cool features, but that is one of the biggest ones. We won't explore it now, but just giving you context of it. Now, the main thing we need GitHub for now is just so we can upload our code into GitHub, and then we can use a deployment service to take that code from GitHub and deploy it on the web. So to do this, you'll need to go to the GitHub website, github.com, sign up for an account. And once your account is set up, you can press new here to create a new repository. You can give it a name. So similar to what we did for Convex, I am just going to call this test app. For the visibility, you want this to be private. You don't want other people to be able to view your code. And then you can just press create repository. And now on this screen, you have this URL. And so you can press this button to copy that URL. And what we'll ultimately do with this URL is we'll give this to AI so it can upload our repository in Cursor to this GitHub repository. And in GitHub, we have a bunch of commands here that it says we can run to upload to this repository. But before we can do all this in Cursor, we need to authenticate with GitHub. So we need to log into GitHub because remember, this is a private repository. So only until we've logged into GitHub are we allowed to actually upload to the repository. And to do this, I'm going to just start a new chat. And to illustrate the point, I just want to show you that if you're ever in this predicament, you can literally just ask AI how to do it. Great, so that now works. I'm logged into GitHub. And so with this URL, I'm going to give this to AI and ask AI to commit and push to this repository. Commit and push are just fancy words. They essentially mean upload this to this GitHub repository. And so once that is all done, if you switch back over to GitHub and refresh the page, you should see all of the code successfully uploaded. And so now that we have this in GitHub, we can use a hosting provider and link that hosting provider to our GitHub repository so the hosting provider can host our code and deploy it somewhere. Now, there's a bunch of different hosting providers out there, each with their own pros and cons. For this, I'm going to use Netlify because we can very easily link it to our GitHub repository, and the free plan should be more than adequate for now. So I'm going to sign up. Once you enter your information, you'll be asked to select where your project exists. So in our case, it is in GitHub, so we can click GitHub, choose your account, so I can press continue, authorize Netlify, will be routed back, and then just press continue again. You'll then in GitHub be asked to select where you want to install Netlify, so you can select your account, and you can choose if you want to install it in all repositories or only select repositories. For this, I am just going to select our test app repository and then install it. We'll then be brought back to Netlify here, so I can click on test app. Now, before we do this, the only thing we need to keep in mind is how we deploy Convex, because as I mentioned, towards the start, there's a Convex development environment and there's a Convex production environment, and our deployed app should use the production environment. So before I go through with this, I'm going to ask AI how I can deploy Convex to production. And so as it says, after we deploy this, we need to update the configuration and update the Convex URL so it points to our production Convex URL. So I will deploy this. You can see in real time the deployment. And so now that that is done, we need to add that Convex URL environment variable. So how you can do that is you can scroll to the top and click options and click deploy settings. And then in the left here, you can click environment variables. And for this, before we do this, I'm going to go back to Cursor. And here it said we need the Vite Convex URL. And I'm just going to copy this for a case match because it needs to be a one-to-one case match for it to be recognized. I will add a single variable and I will paste in that Vite Convex URL. Here we're asked if this environment variable will contain secret values. This is applicable if you had an API key, for example. So in the use case I gave earlier about using OpenAI, in that case, that is very much something that has secret values because you would get billed for your usage. So you wouldn't want someone else to use your API key. But for this in Convex URL, it's not a secret value, so we can leave this unticked. We will give it all scopes, and we will have different values for each deploy context. So what this means is whenever we are in the preview of the app, so like the staging environment, we want to use our development deployment in Convex, so the development environment. However, in the production app, we want to use a production deployment for Convex, so the live database. So let's fill in the URL for the deploy previews. So in Convex, you can click settings here, and on this page, you have this cloud URL. And when you copy this cloud URL, just make sure you are in the development environment. So you can copy this cloud URL, paste this in for the deployed previews, and then switch back to Convex. Click again here at the top, and now click production. And once that is done, again, you just need to open it and click production here, and you now have your production cloud URL. So we can copy this, and then in Netlify, paste this in for the production value. And then we can press create variable. So now that that is set up, we just need to redeploy our app so this environment variable can take effect. So to do that, you can click deploys here, you can click trigger deploy, and then you can just click deploy project. And so that is now done. And so we can click this preview button. You will see the working deployed version of your application. However, if we try and sign in, this shouldn't work. And as you see, it did not work. Now, the reason for this is that the changes we made on GitHub were applied to the main branch. And whenever you make a change to the main branch, this is automatically detected in Netlify as the production branch. And so because it's the production branch, it used the production environment in Convex. And up to this point, we've been using the development environment. So no users exist in our production environment in Convex, which is why my credentials didn't work. And so to get around this for now, I'm again just going to ask Cursor to create me as a user, but this time in our production environment in Convex. That is done apparently, and before we check it in the app, we can check it in Convex directly. So if I go over to Convex, I'm in the production environment, and if I go to data, I can see there is indeed this new user in our production environment. So now if we switch over to the application, I will try and sign in with incorrect credentials, and that did not work, which is expected. And if I now use the correct credentials, I am signed in successfully. And I will switch us to light mode. And as you can see here, we have no products. And again, the reason for this is because we are now using our production environment in Convex. And this is crucial when it comes to application development because we want to have those isolated environments. We want a specific database for development. So in case we do anything bad, basically, it doesn't impact our production environment. And then obviously, likewise, we have an isolated production environment that has its own database and functions. And just to illustrate this point, I'm in production in Convex. And if I was to go to the products table, you can see nothing exists. But if in Convex, I switch to the development environment and go to the products table, you can see we have those products. So what we see in the UI in our application matches exactly what we see in Convex. And so that covers everything. We've covered what Cursor is and how you can install it. We've covered what Node and NPM is and how to install them. We covered how to get started with that template. We covered what the difference is between a front end and a back end. We covered what MCPs and tools are. We covered what Convex is and how you could install it. We covered how to use the different modes of Cursor, so agent, plan, debug, and ask. We covered what Cursor rules are. We covered how to build in Cursor. We covered at a very high level understanding the different parts of your code/repository. We covered how to preview your application, so how to run it locally on your machine. We covered how to structure your building process, so thinking about what the dependencies are of the different features that you want to build and starting with features with the least dependencies. We covered how to add visual ways to verify security in your application. Again, just to reinforce the point, the visual ways are a helper, but they are not the definitive way. The only true definitive way is for a developer to go in and look at the code. However, if for your use case, you don't need to be that strict about it and you can get by just by doing your own visual checks, then we covered how to add those. We covered the tips for editing in a no-code way, so editing elements directly in the Cursor browser preview or via the Agentation integration. We covered what Git is, so GitHub, how to set it up and how to install it. And finally, we covered how to deploy your application to the World Wide Web. Now, in the world of web development, what we've covered here is really just us dipping our toes into things. There's a lot more to cover. But with what we've covered, you should hopefully be able to see just how much is possible with AI. AI is not the end all be all. Again, you need developers to be able to truly verify and secure things. However, AI can get us very, very far, and potentially all the way depending on how strict your security requirements are. If you've got this far and your imagination is now running wild in terms of the custom software you can implement in your own business, but you just don't have the technical expertise to do so, or at least the technical expertise to do so securely. If you want someone technical to handle this for you, then please do get in touch. There'll be a link in the description. Me and my team build internal software for businesses on a daily basis. So that brings us to the end of this course. If there's anything specific you would like to see next, then please do let me know in the comments. And if you have any questions as you go through this, again, please leave them in the comments. And also, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like. Let me know in the comments. It takes quite a long time to put all of this together. So seeing it was of value in any way lets me know that I should do this again. And the future videos will probably be focused around how you can use Cursor to build with a no-code backend. So you can get AI to build the front end for you, so all the stuff that won't have security concerns, but you can then handle the backend and get hands-on with all of the logic that involves security. And so, with that said, thank you so much. I shall catch you in the next one. And if you're not too sure where to go from here, here is another video I have created in the past. I'm not sure what it will be. We shall see what YouTube recommends.